Hello and welcome back to Rock Records Reviewed. My name's Adam, and this week we're going to take a look at the four studio albums by jangly 80s indie legends, the Smiths. The Smiths, of course, are from Manchester in the north of England. They formed in 1982 when singer Morrissey got together with guitarist Johnny Marr, bass player Andy Rourke, drummer Mike Joyce, and eventually signed to the independent Rough Trade label. They were only together for 5 years before internal relationships broke up the band in 1987. Undoubtedly one of the most influential bands of the last 40 years, their jangly guitar-led sound was really out of step with the sort of synth-orientated 80s. And combined with Morrissey's brilliant, witty, acerbic lyrics and bookish asexual image, they were kind of the ideal band for displaced teenagers to go to, and I think they sort of have been ever since. To be honest, I came a bit late to the Smiths. I never quite appreciated them at the time. I was something of a pompous rocker listening to Iron Maiden and AC/DC, in my denim jacket covered in patches, and I thought it was all a bit pretentious and insipid. How wrong I was. Not long after they broke up, I really got into the band, and I soon became a big admirer not just of their music, but also Morrissey's uniqueness as a rock star and their legacy on the music scene. Nowadays, Morrissey certainly says some controversial stuff and is an acquired taste. But, I think rock music needs characters like Morrissey to keep it controversial and interesting and on the front pages of culture magazines and anti-culture magazines. But we're here to discuss the music. Now, all four of these albums have been listed in Rolling Stone's all-time top 500, so they are highly regarded. But let's see which ones are better than others. Let's crack into it. At number 4 from 1987, I'm putting their final album, Strange Ways Here We Come, their fourth and final album. After the previous album, Queen is Dead, the band really felt that Rough Trade were not doing enough to promote them, and after a sort of a lengthy legal dispute with them, they finally left the land of the independents and signed with a major label, which was EMI. But it was all to no avail because by the time this album came out, the band had already split up. Internal politics and outside influences just proved too much, and their 5 years at the top came to an end, and the band imploded in a blaze of glory. It has to be said, really. During recording, Johnny Marr wanted to take the sound somewhere new. He was sick of the cliche jingle jangle guitar sound they'd become famous for. And so, along with Stephen Street, again, who we've talked about from Blur days, the sound he made with Morrissey and Marr, who co-produced on this, it's much crisper. You have new instruments to the fore, particularly piano. The album opens, in fact, with piano, and even Morrissey, for the first time, plays an instrument on a Smiths album, as he plays piano on Death of a Disco Dancer on this. So it is a slightly richer, lusher sound than before, and there are some great moments on here. Stop me if you think you've heard this one before. Last Night I Dreamt Somebody Loved Me. But I also think there's a bit of a weariness on this, which sounds weird talking about a Smiths album and a sense of weariness, but I think a weariness that's really not necessarily that intentional on some of these songs. Something like Death of a Disco Dancer sounds a bit... weary, I think, is the best way to put it. And I don't think Girlfriend in a Coma is one of their greatest singles myself. I don't even think Morrissey is necessarily on his best form on this album, and undoubtedly there are fewer memorable lines on this album than I think on the previous albums. Now look, don't get me wrong, this is by no means a bad album by any stretch, and some Smith fans do rate it as their best. But for me, it just lacks the killer punch and the killer singles or two that, I really like a great album to be peppered with. And number 3 from 1985, their second album, Meat is Murder. This album is much more political. It's less shoegazing, for a better phrase. I hate that phrase, but it's hard not to use it when you talk about bands like the Smiths and the Cure and people like that. And it's not as introverted as their debut. It's far more opinionated. Topics like politics, veganism, corporal punishment are rife throughout this album. Songs like Headmaster Ritual and Russian Ruffians carry those messages. That Joke Isn't Funny Anymore was the main single from this album. It's not one of their best known singles, I don't think. The best track from this period is actually How Soon Is Now, which was the B-side to a single that came out before this album, William, It Was Really Nothing. And it was not on the original album, but it was famously used in a cinema ad around this time and re-released and added to later on versions. There is a theme there with the Smiths, as they often made great singles, like William, It Was Really Nothing, that didn't end up on the studio albums, and you had to get them on compilation albums later, which we'll talk about in a while. Overall, the sound is a lot fleshier. It's more textured than the debut album. Miles really coming to the fore here. He's a real new kind of guitar hero with his intricate, clever lines sitting in the mix, weaving a sort of a jangly tapestry over Morrissey's lyrics. It also has to be said that Andy Rourke's bass lines were not always so obvious either, and I think sometimes his unusual choice of root notes added to the Smiths' musical ethereal aura. And that feeling that sometimes you couldn't quite pin down the melodies. And that meant that when a real primary top line for a chorus kicked in, it had even more impact, I think. Number two already. It's only 4 albums to get through. I'm putting their debut album from 1984, The Smiths. Now, The Smiths had an immediate impact on the music scene when they arrived. They did Top of the Pops in 1983, and we'd never seen anything like it. Top of the Pops was this fantastic show we used, for those not watching from the UK, Top of the Pops, this fantastic show that we used to have on 7 o'clock on a Thursday night, eventually moved to Friday. And everybody watched it. And of course, we'd all talk about what we'd seen the next morning in school. And one of those absolute water cooler moments was Morrissey with the band singing This Charming Man. And there he was with his enormous quiff, dandying about the stage, holding some flowers in hand. You can find it on YouTube. Top of the Pops, 1983. This Charming Man, The Smiths. This Charming Man was like one of those songs earlier. It wasn't on this album. It was added to later US versions. As I said, a history of great singles, not on the original studio albums. But this album has a muted start. For an album with such an enormous impact on the musical culture at the time, it's very understated. Reel Around the Fountain. It's a melancholic start, certainly. But you can really see how it sort of struck a chord with bed sitters everywhere. Got to number 2, but the album also has Hand That Rocks the Cradle, Hand in Glove, and What Difference Does It Make? And look, it's not for everyone, this sound. You know, the 80s were a real primary day-glow coloured decade, and a lot of people were immediately, accusing the Smiths of being a bedwetting band with a lot of shoegazing pretentiousness. But I think if you were open to it, you'd hear that it was chock full of clever, witty lyrics, and really interesting rhyming meters as well that Morrissey sang with, and really heartbreaking observational imagery. It was clear that there was a new lyrical genius on the block. And the sound of the album was certainly out of step with the time, with its references to the Byrds and the Velvet Underground, and T-Rex and Joy Division. But I think that combination of jangly guitar and understated vocal delivery and sort of faux disinterest of the protagonists made them unlike anything we'd heard for many, many years, certainly since the Velvet Underground. The album was produced by John Porter, who, funny enough, went on to produce a great many blues acts. And it's quite rough and demo-y in places. Originally, it was going to be produced by Troy Tate, who'd done a lot of work with the Velvet Underground, with Teardrop Explodes. And John Porter heard these demos, and he said, these are out of time, they're out of tune, I can do much, much better, give me a shot at it. And they did, and that was probably a good move. The album got to number 2 in the UK charts, where it stayed for 33 weeks, which is no bad going for a debut at all. It's made countless top 100 albums of the 80s and all-time lists. As debut albums go, there are a few that have more impact in signalling the arrival of a major new band on the scene. As an aside, Paul Carrack plays organ on piano and organ on some of this album. And he also played some organ on one of my albums. So there you go. I'm 1 degree of separation away from the Smiths. But you Smiths fans will certainly have guessed by now that my number one album is from 1986, and it's their third album, The Queen Is Dead. So this album was made amongst great turmoil. It was actually finished in 1985. And the band was in dispute with Rough Trade for months and months and months. And there was all sorts of internal stuff going on. And all around this time, Andy Rourke kept getting fired from the band for drink and drug issues. He was replaced on a North American tour by Craig Gannon. And then he was back again, and they decided to keep Gannon on. So they ended up having 2 guitars for a while, certainly on the road. And then Guy Pratt, famously from Pink Floyd and Madonna, he came in on bass when Rourke was then arrested on drug possession charges. It was produced by Morrissey and Marr and engineered by Stephen Street. And they did a demo of The Boy with a Thorn in His Side, and they were obviously all doing something right, because when they heard it back, they thought, this is good enough to release as a single. We don't have to re-record this. And that's always a great sign that you're doing something right, when your demos are good enough to release as singles. The sound is certainly thicker, I think, and the playing is tougher on this album, but there's still subtle in places, and Marr is as intricate and nimble as ever. And Morrissey's on absolutely peerless form on this album, demonstrated by lyrics on songs like There Is a Light That Never Goes Out, and the title track, and Big Mouth Strikes Again. He sings of Joan of Arc as the flames rose to her Roman nose and her Walkman started to melt. Where does that come from? It doesn't matter, but I love it. It's great. The whole album is musically confident and more strident than ever, I think. I think perhaps that inner turmoil was giving Morrissey and Marr some steel to come up with the goods. It's one of those albums I don't really think it has any weak tracks. It's got the killer singles that we've mentioned before, but a great supporting cast. I Know It's Over, Cemetery Gates, Vicar in a Tutu. And as with all the Smiths' best stuff, it's funny, it's wicked, it's playful, it's abstract, it's sad, and often deeply, deeply moving. Not least to sort of young shoegazing music fans who were sort of teens in the 80s, and now they find this music deeply, deeply nostalgic to listen to. Well, look, that's it. That's only 4 albums to get through, but I've tried to go into a little bit of detail with all of them, and as ever, I'm sure you don't agree. Let me know what you think. Where did the Smiths go from here? Well, as I've said earlier, much of the Smiths' best stuff wasn't on any of these albums, so you have to go finding it on compilations like Hatful of Hollow, which was an early compilation album of singles and B-sides. Louder Than Bombs was another really good compilation. In fact, those are probably the 2 best ones, but you can get later at sort of like singles discography compilations and things like that, but they miss a lot of the really interesting sort of tracks that something like Hatful of Hollow has. Rank, I thought, was also quite an enjoyable live album when they had Craig Gannon in on guitar. He'd moved from replacing Andy Rourke on bass to guitar, and so there's a real sort of muscular sound on that one. Sadly, Rourke and Joyce took Morrissey and Marr to court over royalties, which lasted a long, long time. I think they lost. And Johnny Marr's had a fascinating music career, playing with all sorts of different people, from Blondie to, as we talked about last week, Blondie to Electronic and the Pretenders. And Morrissey has had a wildly varying solo career, which I think has at times seen him make some music which is absolutely right up there with the very, very best Smith stuff. But that's probably a show for another time. Anyway, there we go. Fairly quick one this week, but I think, the Smiths being the Smiths were an important band to cover. I hope you've enjoyed it. Let me know your thoughts on the Smiths in the comments below, and we can discuss them. But until next week, I hope you stay well, and I will see you soon. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.